today we're talking about France. A week ago we were discussing UK. 2 months from now it might be the US again. The problem is endemic across the advanced world. The long-term public debt trajectory as a result of aging populations is unsustainable. No political party across the advanced world has a serious or credible plan to bring it down. And markets are staring at a factor of 2 or 3 order increase in debt as far as the eye can see. And this is happening at a time when pension funds and the natural buyers have basically gobbled up as much debt as they need. And now we see the economic consequences of that. It's the politics and the challenges associated with fixing short-term budgets. It's the economic consequences, slow growth from crowding out and political uncertainty. And the reality is, until either the bond market forces a government to make serious steps, let's call it long-term austerity because that's what it is, to fix these budget problems, or someone convinces through a democratic vote the electorate that this is the step that needs to be taken, we're not going to escape this. We're now in a repeating cycle of foreboding and worries about fiscal issues. The good news is we're all going to panic once a government is forced to do austerity, long-run austerity, and the economic consequences, I think, will be almost immediately positive because you'll bring down bond yields, you'll have long-term confidence in the fiscal situation, and businesses and households and banks that have got ample balance sheet capacity around the advanced world will then just start to behave much more normally.
I think that's very interesting that you remain glass half full despite
I
that
always am.
threat. 50 years of sort of expanding budgets, tax receipts that don't cover it in a lot of developed countries, and yet the fallout of that could still be positive is interesting. I mean, look, I'll pick up on one other thing. I don't often do this, but reading Mario Draghi, Politico has a story out this morning about Draghi, and they look at all of the instances where Mario Draghi is saying you must listen, and European leaders must listen to the big plan that he laid out. Yep. I mean, they all signed up to it, at least, in terms of ideas, but none of them have really been able to deliver.
The central thrust of his plan, which is, in my view, absolutely right, is to recognize that, and let's throw the US in here, because even though the US is the sort of the well-behaved child in class when it comes to regulatory policy, it's in a bad group, let's be clear. We have over-regulated ourselves as we've grown governments, and the result of that is now we prohibit major parts of economic activity simply through the rules that we set ourselves. And so the way to resolve this long-term structural budget issue, which is to say, yes, we're going to have to spend more on healthcare and welfare because it is right that we want to avoid inflicting indignities on an aging population. You need to generate sustainable tax revenue from doing that. So give yourself more economy to tax. If you take the artificial the artificial impediments through the rules and regulatory system away, what you'll find is whole chunks of economic activity, which today are just not permitted, will happen. You'll be able to tax that. Then you'll be able to finance the budgets in the long run. So it has to be both of these things.
But you can also broaden that conversation out globally, right?
Yeah,
if there's
absolutely.
a risk that the U.S. is headed into some sort of slowdown, if you believe the labor market data is showing labor demand softening, a U.S. recession could cause some pain also for Europe, which means, frankly, you don't get that nominal GDP growth that you need to keep those tax receipts, on par with what you're spending.
I think that's completely right. I mean, this is now, well, as we know, it's eased off a little bit over the past week because now we're anticipating Fed cuts towards the end of the year. But the global worries over fiscal sustainability, which caused the long end of the curve to move out last week, that's the third time this year that's happened. Just to be clear, we've had that twice already. We had that, I think it was in February. We had it in April. This is not going to go away. The question is, and to your point, how does it change? Do you get a government convincing a public, actually, we need to start taking away some of these promises in order to get our economies on track? Or does the bond market force a country to fix its ways? My view is, unfortunately, the UK is the most vulnerable because of the not because its economic growth is weak. Actually, we've got the second fastest growth in the G7, or that the budget looks worse. It doesn't. It looks sort of, we're a bit of a middling country in the G7 when it comes to the public finances. But because the nature of the gilt market is, it's smaller, it doesn't benefit from the natural buy that you have in Japan, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, or the hard currency aspect of the euro. And, unfortunately, we have had 10 years of repeated and highly visible policy mistakes that now get priced in as a premium at the long end of the curve. I think that we're going to be pleasantly surprised when a government actually bites the bullet and fixes this. I don't think it's 2010 where we should have been genuinely fearful of austerity. I think you're looking at full employment economies with good private sector balance sheets, and governments should be actively pursuing fiscal policies which depress inflation and depress interest rates for the good of the private economy.
I'll come back to the UK in a minute. 50 basis points from the Fed, though, in
Too soon.
Too soon.
Too soon, in my view. Too soon.
And too much priced in then to cuts next year, or about right? How do you see it?
150 basis points is priced for the end of the year.
I've got 100 basis points more, which I think feels about right. I think the skew is probably towards more rather than less. The Fed has been faced with a puzzle over summer, which is to say, which side of our mandate are we likely to stray further from as a result of the administration's policies? Are we going to stray further away from our employment mandate or our inflation mandate? The market has concluded basically conclusively the employment side of the mandate is at risk. Now, what more than the inflation side of the mandate? Now, what the Fed typically does is reacts more aggressively and at a faster pace to downside risks to employment and growth than it does upside risks to inflation, which is why roughly this time last year we got the 50 basis point cut from the Fed when we activated the SARM rule, this kind of 0.5 increase in the unemployment rate. But it's still not clear that we're at the other side of the inflation risk hump. So my guess is the weakness in the US economy for now will encourage the Fed to think about potentially going over successive meetings. If the inflation risks really, really dissipate and the economic data start to look really bad, I think it makes sense that we start to ask the question, will the Fed go 50 basis points? But I think there's been too much political pressure on the administration, by the administration onto the Fed, for the Fed, I think, to just say, we'll take the risk on 50 basis points already, because the danger will be that inflation surprises to the upside over the next couple of months and the long end of the bond market starts to panic again.
No, I mean, it does seem to be like the risk to markets is a bond market blow up, but we reversed the last one so quickly that my mind goes to the fact that, you're having markets tell us one thing. You've got equity markets at all-time highs, high yield credit spreads really tight, even home builders outperforming the NASDAQ in the last few months. That is not something that's telling us the cycle is turning. But then you have this labor market data, which is showing some signs that demand is softening. How do you pin these two together to create a narrative of how the Fed should handle those two things?
The Fed is always facing a set of trade-offs. The US economy is highly cyclical, and the momentum in the upward part of the cycle over the past few years has by and large not been driven by robust private sector growth. Really, the growth has come from an expansion in public spending through the Biden administration's three big fiscal plans. I mean, note actually, if you strip away government consumption from the past 2.5 years, where the run rate of the US economy has been 3% annualized, you have a sub 2% growth economy. So what you're now facing actually is weakness in the private sector as a lot of these fiscal things wear off. So the arithmetic for the economy is for things to slow down. The danger is that consumers and businesses anticipate a slowdown, and US households that have not been saving all that much anyway start to then do some precautionary saving, and businesses that have some good profits for a quarter or two start to retain more earnings. And then you see this cyclical momentum really turn sharply to the downside. I don't think that's my base case. I think the base case is the US is going to be a sort of 1.5–2% growth economy for the next few years, which is not a million miles away from its potential.
Really briefly, I do want to ask you about Reform UK. The whole of Europe, you look at Norway, you look at the UK, we're being affected by right-wing US policies.
Yep.
But there's something novel, surely, about Reform UK riding high in the polls with very few MPs, talking about actually killing certain projects if they're brought forwards by the Labour government. That seems quite a new place and unstable and difficult for markets and businesses, no?
The next political cycle in the UK will mark a very significant lurch, in my view, towards, let's call them free market economic policies, that's opening energy markets, deregulating, shrinking the size of the state. This is not so dissimilar to what happened both in the US and the UK in the early 80s. What we had in the UK is a succession of governments all in the same variety, starting with Blair right up until Starmer. There's not that much difference actually between the politics of Boris Johnson or David Cameron or Starmer. It's just that for best part of 14 years, it was very easy to say, well, this is the Conservative Party that are not of sufficient quality to run the country. Now that Starmer has had the try and people don't like it, notice that a good majority in the UK now favour parties right of centre. It suggests that the gravity of politics has moved against Starmer. That's probably the bigger story, actually, than his own failures.
Yeah, very interesting, Kallum.
Thank
Thank you
you
so much for being with us.